January 17, 1940. The North Pacific is a grinding expanse of gray steel and grayer sky. Aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer Shiokaze, the world is defined by cold efficiency, the damp scent of salt, and the rigid discipline enforced by hunger. The men eat a careful, measured portion of rice, dried fish, and pickled plum, consumed quickly, in silence, their bowls clattering the only sound in the suffocating ritual of survival. Every calorie, every morsel of food is a finite gift from the Dai Nippon Teikoku, the great empire, a necessary fuel for the sacred mission of expansion. The prevailing ideology, built on the strength of spirit, the legendary Yamato soul, dictated that hardship was not merely tolerated. It was a necessary crucible, forging men into unyielding instruments of conquest. Luxury was a weakness, a Western affliction. Abundance was a dangerous distraction from the purity of sacrifice. For the Imperial Command, the war ahead was a matter of swift, decisive strikes, of seizing the resource-rich perimeter and creating an impenetrable defensive zone. Victory was predicted not by material superiority, an advantage they knew they did not hold, but by superior will, by the fanatical devotion of every soldier and sailor. Their enemies, particularly the Americans, were viewed through a lens of contemptuous caricature. Spoiled, soft, materialistic, prone to surrender when deprived of their comforts. The very idea of prolonged logistical warfare, a slugging match of factories and supply chains, seemed irrelevant against the promise of a glorious, short, and conclusive struggle. They believed the Americans would wilt under the strain of real fighting, missing their silk stockings and their cinema halls, their automobiles, and their excessive suites. But across the vast indifferent ocean, another war machine was slowly, almost lazily stirring to life. It was a machine fueled not just by steel and oil, but by an expectation of comfort, a democratic right to a small daily pleasure, even amidst the most brutal, far-flung combat. This was the machine of American industry, the apparatus of the arsenal of democracy, and its scale was not merely quantitative, it was philosophical. The Americans fundamentally believed that their fighting man deserved to be well fed, not just adequately sustained, but nourished and content. The first true collision of these two worldviews occurred not in a naval engagement, but in the relentless, mud-choked hell of Guadalcanal in late 1942. For the Japanese soldiers on the island, the environment was a relentless, starvation-inducing enemy. Their supply ships, exposed to the relentless rain of American air power, were often sunk before they reached shore, leading to what the Japanese themselves grimly called the starvation battle. Men fought on courage and willpower, their thin bodies ravaged by malaria and dysentery, subsisting on meager rations of roots, boiled leaves, and, in the most extreme cases, the unthinkable. They looked across the narrow lines toward the Marines, seeing men of immense size, clothed well, equipped with automatic weapons that never seemed to run out of ammunition. They heard the constant, almost irritating sound of American bulldozers carving out airfields, a sound that spoke of immediate replacement, of endless material renewal. The deepest, most unsettling contrast, however, was not in the immediate battlefield supply, the plentiful K-rations or the warm uniforms, but in the logistical tale that supported these forces. It was a revelation that struck at the core of the Japanese ideological conviction. The Japanese officer, seasoned by years of brutal conflict in China, understood the logistical challenge of moving rice and bullets across thousands of miles of water. He could rationalize the supply of gasoline, of medicine, of heavy artillery. These were necessities of war. But what began to filter back to the headquarters in Rabaul were reports that transcended military logic and plunged directly into the surreal. The Americans, the soft, spoiled Americans, were not merely supplying necessities. They were supplying luxuries on an industrial scale. The first reports were anecdotal, dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. A captured American storehouse in the Solomons, expected to hold emergency rations, was found instead to contain cases upon cases of tinned peaches, pre-cooked ham, and, most astonishingly, ice cream powder. Then came the data, filtered through intelligence intercepts and prisoner interrogations, revealing the scale of the operation. The Americans had dedicated an entire fleet of specialized support vessels to the Pacific effort, ships built not to carry bombs or troops, but to carry the very comforts of home. The logistical miracle was focused around the refrigerated stores ships, AF, and most bewilderingly to the Japanese high command, the dedicated ice cream barges and floating production plants. In the midst of the most unforgiving, tropical combat zone on Earth, where Japanese soldiers were reduced to 90 pounds of skin and bone, dreaming of a single full bowl of rice, the American forces were consuming a constant, measured flow of ice cream. It was not a wartime luxury. It was a component of the official U.S. Navy and Marine Corps morale structure. The U.S. Navy estimated that a serving of ice cream was a non-negotiable part of the crew's diet, an institutional expectation that was maintained regardless of danger or distance. To the Japanese commander, indoctrinated in the belief that the material world must yield to the spiritual one, the sheer existence of a ship dedicated solely to making ice cream was not just a symbol of American wealth. It was an obscene, incomprehensible affront to the very concept of warfare. It spoke of a civilization that had mastered abundance to such a degree that it could export an entirely non-essential, perishable delicacy across the globe, at the cost of vast fuel, complex machinery, and precious manpower. Take the USS Pastores, an early refrigerated ship converted for military supply, or the later USS Artisan class. These were floating cold storage facilities, but within their hulls were also dedicated processing centers. The American industrial genius, which could mass-produce Liberty ships and B-29 bombers, had been equally applied to the mass production of frozen dairy dessert. These ships carried tons of powdered milk, sugar, and flavorings, alongside the immense refrigeration units necessary to churn, harden, and store the finished product in the tropics. They were distributing not just the occasional treat, but an average of 10 million gallons of ice cream per year to the fleet by 1945. This logistical feat required not only the ships themselves but a massive, coordinated chain of infrastructure stretching from the dairy farms of Wisconsin to the cold storage warehouses in California, and finally across the Pacific to every major fleet anchor in the war zone. It was a chain unbroken by submarine attacks or logistical choke points, a testament to an industrial base that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could conceive. The recurring symbol of this imbalance was a simple yet profoundly unsettling object to the Japanese: the thin aluminum spoon. This was the spoon used in American mess halls and on the decks of carriers. It was mass-produced to the point of disposability, cheap, light, and perfectly formed, a material manifestation of an economy that viewed resources as boundless. In the Imperial Japanese Army, utensils were often wooden, meticulously cared for, and treated as precious personal gear. The American aluminum spoon, disposable after a single use of vanilla ice cream, represented not just luxury, but a casual, almost insulting, indifference to scarcity. For the Japanese high command, reports of these ice cream ships generated confusion and a deep, gnawing anxiety. The American soldier was not fighting on willpower alone. He was fighting on a full stomach, fortified by a psychological comfort that was a direct link back to the soda fountains and drugstores of his peacetime life. This was the democratic promise materialized: the right to comfort, the right to abundance even in war. The emotional contrast was staggering. In New Guinea, a Japanese patrol might spend 3 days searching for edible grubs and roots to keep their unit alive, while 50 miles away on an American destroyer, the crew would line up for their evening ration. The simple joy of the cold, creamy vanilla melting on their tongue, a taste of absolute unapologetic civilization. The American commanders understood this profound psychological weapon. Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Forces, famously said, "Give me men who are tired of fighting and I'll give you ice cream." It was a recognition that morale was not built purely on flag-waving and threats of punishment, but on the restoration of normalcy, on the consistent provision of small, tangible comforts that reaffirmed the value of the individual soldier. The contrast found its way into official Japanese intelligence reports. One captured document from 1944, intended for internal use, detailed American supply habits with incredulity, noting the excessive, almost wasteful quantities of highly specialized foodstuffs. It calculated the weight and volume dedicated to non-essential items like carbonated beverages, canned fruit cocktail, and, yes, the raw materials for ice cream. The report concluded with a chilling lack of ideological bravado. that the enemy possessed a resource base that does not comprehend limits, and an organizational will to support the individual soldier's comfort that is unprecedented in military history. This realization was a fundamental shift in perception, a crack in the ideological foundation of the Axis war effort. The Japanese had prepared to fight an army. They were instead fighting an industrialized continent, one which moved not just bullets and beans but happiness across the deepest ocean. The same shock resonated, though perhaps less sweetly, in the European theater. Germany's industrial effort was formidable, focused and ruthlessly efficient, but it was built on a foundation of ersatz, the substitution of expensive or unavailable materials with cheaper, often inferior replacements. German soldiers drank coffee brewed from acorns and barley. Their bread was mixed with wood pulp fillers, and their uniforms were made of synthetic fibers that chafed and offered poor insulation. Austerity was a virtue, a sign of national resolve. When American forces landed in North Africa and then in Italy, German officers and enlisted men encountered a similar spectacle of overflowing plenty. They saw the endless convoys of American GI trucks, the massive tires made of real rubber, the sheer scale of the canned goods, and the ubiquitous presence of Coca-Cola, which the Americans saw as a morale necessity, not a luxury. The recurring symbolism, while not focused on ice cream in the European theater, held the same meaning: mass production as a cultural artifact. The German soldier, trained to conserve every round and every drop of gasoline, was confronted by a foe who seemed to discard everything freely. American Jeeps were often abandoned when a minor repair was required, simply replaced by a new one rolling off the next ship. This was not carelessness. It was the arithmetic of an industrial base that valued time and rapid deployment far more than the preservation of a single, replaceable machine. German intelligence noted the high caloric content of the American ration, the variety, the quality. The German soldier's K-ration was 3,000 calories, monotonous and based on necessity. The American equivalent was a culinary spread by comparison, designed for taste, variety, and the psychological boost of choice. The psychological impact of this material gap proved to be a corrosive force, particularly in the later years of the war. For the Japanese commanders, the early shock evolved into a grim, fatalistic understanding. The war was no longer a contest of spirit. It was a race they had lost before it began, a competition between the will of a few and the boundless, mechanized generosity of an entire nation. The diary entries of captured Japanese soldiers speak volumes about this transformation. One entry, recovered from a dead soldier on Peleliu in 1944, noted only this: "They have so much rice they feed it to the pigs. They have white bread every day. Their ships make ice cream. Our will is strong, but their material is eternal." The ideology that preached spiritual strength over material weakness had found its fatal flaw. Against a foe whose material abundance was itself an expression of a confident, expansive, and deeply productive national spirit, willpower alone could not prevail. The provision of ice cream became a deeply rooted institutional policy for the U.S. Navy and the Army's service forces, evolving into a finely tuned logistical dance. Special ice cream mix, a dry powder formula containing milk solids, sugar, and stabilizers, was packaged in standardized crates, designed to be easily handled by the artisan-class cargo ships. The refrigeration systems on these ships were colossal, requiring dedicated engineering crews just to maintain the constant sub-zero temperatures necessary to protect not only the finished ice cream but also the tons of frozen meats, vegetables, and, critically, blood plasma carried for the wounded. The ice cream itself was dispensed, often by the ship's cooks, in a ritual that transcended simple eating. It was a brief moment of home, a tangible piece of Americana transported across the equator. The texture, the chill, the overwhelming sweetness. It was the antithesis of the bitter, harsh reality of naval warfare, of the cramped, sweltering conditions below deck, and the constant threat of attack. It was a psychological anchor. The Japanese soldier, often seeing only his senior officers eat the few available fresh items, lived in a world of hierarchy and scarcity. The American sailor, regardless of rank, stood in the same line, held the same thin aluminum spoon, and consumed the same vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry dessert. This small shared indulgence reinforced a different, more powerful ideology: the democratic belief in the value and equality of every man, and the commitment of the state to his well-being. The shift in Japanese perception was complete. Initially, they viewed the American excess as a sign of decadence. By 1945, they viewed it as a sign of insurmountable, terrifying power. They were not fighting men who were soft. They were fighting men who were backed by a power so vast that it could afford to be soft to its own, while simultaneously delivering the hardest blows imaginable. The ice cream was the proof. A nation that could afford such a luxury in the deadliest environment on earth was a nation that could never be starved, never truly exhausted, and never defeated by attrition. This abundance was not merely a matter of economic scale. It was a cultural mindset. American industry was not just mobilized to create tanks. It was mobilized to create comfort. Factories that made appliances in peacetime seamlessly shifted to making munitions, and the supply lines that delivered soda pop to every corner store were the same ones that now delivered fresh bread and frozen treats to the island garrisons. The whole system was built not on centralized austerity, but on distributed, relentless productivity. The thin aluminum spoon was stamped out by the millions, a disposable tool in an economy that measured efficiency and rapid replacement, not careful preservation. The officers of the Imperial Navy, who had prided themselves on their Spartan lifestyle and self-sacrifice, had to contend with the internal breakdown of morale caused by the simple contrast. How could they ask their men to starve for the emperor when the enemy was making fresh coffee and serving ice cream from dedicated factories floating nearby? The question was rhetorical and devastating. The logistical defeat preceded the military one. The physical bodies of the Japanese forces were weakened by hunger, but their resolve was fatally undermined by the spectacle of limitless American ease. The war had stopped being about heroism and had become a cruel, objective measurement of industrial output, and the sheer volume of frozen dairy was the final, irrefutable metric. The final battles in the Pacific from Iwo Jima to Okinawa were battles fought by Japanese forces already defeated by the cold, hard reality of American abundance. The men who charged Banzai were not just fighting Americans. They were fighting a ghost of plenty, the realization that their enemies' supply lines were infinite, while their own were measured in the last grains of rice and the final ounces of stagnant water. The experience of fighting the United States had fundamentally transformed the global perception of military power. The myth of the Spartan warrior overcoming the materialistic horde was shattered, replaced by the understanding that in modern industrial warfare, the spirit follows the supply chain. The ability to project comfort and normalcy across the globe was a display of national strength, far more potent than any single battleship or division. It was the ability to keep a society whole, even when fighting a war of annihilation thousands of miles from its shores. Epilogue. And so, the vast, unforgiving ocean, which swallowed so many ships and so many dreams, yielded a simple, cold truth. Victory in the greatest conflict in history was not defined solely by the thunder of the main guns or the flight of the fighter planes. It was also determined by the gentle whir of a powerful refrigeration unit, turning powdered milk and sugar into a moment of chilled relief. The Japanese command saw the ships carrying aircraft and tanks and resolved to fight. But when they heard of the ships carrying ice cream, a non-essential perishable joy, they saw the true, boundless nature of the enemy. It was the ultimate expression of a free society's power, not merely to destroy but to sustain, not merely to endure hardship, but to refuse unnecessary suffering. The simple, cheap, disposable aluminum spoon, used to scoop the ice cream and then tossed away, became an accidental, powerful symbol. It represented the unburdened ease of a civilization where production was so vast, so efficient, that the smallest comforts were guaranteed, a cold, creamy affirmation of democracy's ultimate resource, its capacity for relentless creative abundance. And in that cool sweetness, the heat of the war and the fervor of a rigid, austere ideology began irreversibly to melt away.